home, and there is a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old tromping around upstairs. So they've been warned, but we'll see how quiet they are for the next 40 minutes or so. So first off, thanks for the invite. I'd love to see people interested in Lake Erie. And so I'm going to kind of run down a state of Lake Erie. This primary talk is more dedicated to the Lake Erie algal issue that's kind of relegated to the Western Basin. But I did put some extra slides after my conclusion slide if anybody has questions about more general Lake Erie and Great Lakes issues. So I'd be happy to entertain any discussion that you are interested in having. Great to see Euclid. I am a West Sider, well, born and raised. So I was in North Ridgeville, West Side. I live in Columbus now with my family, but I'm familiar with Euclid and in that area of the state. Get some logos out of the way. I'll use my laser pointer down here if I can get it to work. So 3 logos you should see. The one to the far left is about a little less than half of my budget, and the work that the program does comes from NOAA, so the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It comes to us because we are what is called a Sea Grant program. So Ohio Sea Grant is one of 34 Sea Grant programs from across the country. Basically, any state that bumps into the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Gulf of Mexico, or Great Lakes has a Sea Grant program. And our NOAA mandated mission is to basically address or recognize and then address the issues that are occurring in Lake Erie. So we work with stakeholders and agencies to identify what's going on in Lake Erie. And then we have the ability to fund research to address those issues. But we also have then the capacity to do education and outreach to make sure we convey those research findings to end users. And then the middle logo is Ohio State University, because I'm also director of Ohio State University Stone Laboratory. So it's our island campus out in the Western Basin of Lake Erie. Me wearing both of that hats makes sense because Stone Lab, that island campus, again, that's owned and operated by Ohio State University, our mission is also research, education, and outreach. So that's why the logos are there. Again, a little bit less than half of my funding comes from Ohio State, and then the other half comes basically from the Sea Grant program that initiates out of NOAA. So what you're seeing now is basically a polygon or a map of Lake Erie, primarily the western and central portion of Lake Erie. We call this a heat map. So basically the warmer the colors, the more red the colors, the more intense and thick the cyanobacteria or harmful algal blooms are in Lake Erie. The cool colors mean lower concentrations, and black represents non-detect. So if the polygon is black, that means there's not blooms. I always put this slide up to basically show people we've been dealing with this harmful algal bloom since the early 2000s, but I also use this figure to illustrate that not every year is the same. You can see in 02 and 07, and if I slide here over to 05, these were pretty mild bloom years versus things like 2011, where my pointer is at, 2015, and you can see this dark, dark, dark red associated with 2017. So the blooms aren't the same every year, but clearly they've been present, and I would argue increasing since the early 2000s. So why, when we think about harmful algal blooms, do we always think about Lake Erie? And so I put this figure up to remind folks that Lake Erie is one of 5 Great Lakes. Hopefully we all know that. But those 5 lakes are very, very different. And so if you look Superior to the left here, Huron and Michigan overlaid on top of each other. We won't debate today whether Lake Huron and Michigan is 1 Great Lake or 2. Lake Erie and then Ontario. And as you look at this, something should jump out at you. And typically when we're live, most people raise their hands and yell out, well, Lake Erie is very shallow. And so the reason why I bring this up is because any runoff coming from the watershed, so coming from the land surrounding Lake Erie, is going to be concentrated in the water relative to the other Great Lakes. So Lake Erie doesn't get to adhere to our awesome early 70s environmental movement of the solution to pollution is dilution. That's how we've treated our oceans historically. But basically anything that runs off the watershed that feeds into Lake Erie is going to concentrate into that system. And so primarily we'll be talking about nutrients from the watershed and what they do when they get concentrated in Lake Erie. Rather than just drive this point home with a figure like this, a bathymic map like this, I can also do it with land use numbers. So let me orient you here. So the vertical axis is always to 100, and this is percent land use. The 5 bars represent the 5 Great Lakes, so Erie, Huron, Michigan, Ontario, and Superior. And then the colors within those bars represent land use. Let us draw our attention to Erie. So we're going to start here, and I'll just start throwing up some numbers. So for that light blue on the bottom, we are first in the number of people. So when we think about nutrients entering Lake Erie, we got to point the finger at ourselves first. We have a lot of people living in this watershed in our day-to-day interactions, whether it's using home sewage treatment systems, sending our water to wastewater treatment plants, putting fertilizers on our lawns, or being an agricultural producer is going to have an impact on this lake. The second color is orange, and the number first can show up there too, because of all the 5 Great Lakes, we have the most ag in our watershed. So most of the land use in our watershed is utilized for growing crops or raising animals, or both. But those activities, agricultural production, also has a relationship with nutrients. And so we got to know that those nutrients on the landscape associated with this land use, again, agriculture, is going to have an impact on the system. The gray bar is next. It is pretty negligible from Great Lake to Great Lake, so I will skip over grasslands. But the yellow that you see here is forest. Clearly, you can see that we have the least amount of forest relative to the other 4 Great Lakes. I mention this because often we think of forest systems as a net zero loss of nutrients. There are always exceptions. That's not always, but typically these systems don't contribute large volumes of nutrients into the receiving water bodies. And the last one is the dark blue bar. I could clearly, as looking across these 5 lakes, say that we are the least in what we call wetlands. But I always put up the number 10%. 10% reminds me to tell the audience that I have the pleasure of engaging with that we only have about 10% of historic wetlands remaining in the watershed. The other 90% have been filled in or drained for human use. So development of suburban and urban areas, but also drained to increase agricultural production. So let's move from this slide and just get into, whenever I show a graph, I like to show a little picture just to relax our brains a little bit. But this is a picture of some Canada geese up by the Lake Erie Island. So again, Stone Laboratory in Gibraltar. This is in 2011, which was the second worst bloom on record. But you can see the path that these geese are leaving in that water as they swim. Clearly looks like spilled paint or pea soup. Adding to that, hopefully the color on your image is appropriate, but this is a colleague of mine, Dr. Richard Krause with the USGS, him and his family out by Marblehead. And you can see the size of that bloom, and we even have records of these blooms being thick enough that they actually bog down power boats and sailboats that are trying to recreate on Lake Erie. So a lot of nutrients, a lot of land use activities that could result in nutrients. Let's talk about what we know as far as nutrient sources today. So the Maumee and the Sandusky rivers are the largest P or phosphorus loaders. Let's dive into that a little bit more. 87 to 93, so the first number is the Maumee number, 87, 93 is the Sandusky, comes from what we call non-point sources. So what we're saying is that the Ohio EPA knows where all point sources are. They know where all the pipes are that are dumping liquid into a tributary and therefore into Lake Erie. And they monitor those point sources for phosphorus. And so we know how much phosphorus is coming from all point sources in the Lake Erie drainage associated with Ohio. And so what you do is measure the phosphorus at the end of those rivers and you do the math. If it ain't coming from point source, it's coming from non-point. And so what we know is the phosphorus making it into Lake Erie, driving these blooms, the bulk of it, 87% in the Maumee, 93% in the Sandusky, is coming from surface runoff, non-point runoff, not coming from a pipe. I put nitrogen here for you too. Most people through reading media around Lake Erie and the harmful algal blooms, they hear phosphorus is the issue, phosphorus is the issue. Nitrogen is a player too. If you have phosphorus and nitrogen both, the blooms can actually get bigger than with phosphorus alone. And we also know that for those blooms to go from non-toxic producing to a strain that produces toxins, they need nitrogen. So when we talk about nutrient management, nutrient stewardship on the landscape, we need to be looking through both the lens of phosphorus and nitrogen. The next thing you should know is, of course, that the bulk of these two watersheds is ag. So when we look at land use, greater than 70% of the land in the Sandusky and the Maumee is in ag. And I only put this out here to show that even if a suburban lawn or an urban city or an ag landscape released the same amount of phosphorus, the reality is that ag's going to be responsible for most of it. So this bullet isn't here to put a bullseye on producers or agriculture's back. It is just, as a scientist, we have identified the major source. So it just helps us when managing the problem and when addressing or identifying solutions, is that we know what community we get to work with and who we get to engage. I will say also that 70 to 90%, so it depends on the year, 70 to 90% of the phosphorus occurs during 20% of the flows. Okay, this is data coming from 2002 to 2013. I do need to update that data. But basically what it tells us is that most of the nutrients, again, 70 to 90% of the nutrients, are coming in during basically 10 storm events. The reason why I put this on this slide is because we're getting a lot of attention towards, if you solve HABs, you got to solve nutrients. This bullet reminds me to tell you that this isn't just a nutrient management problem or issue. It is a water management issue. We are in a time and a period in our country and in our globe of global climate change. And all the model predictions show that the Great Lakes are going to see more frequent storm events and larger storm events, and we're going to see increased temperatures. So what we're dealing with today to try and solve this nutrient issue is partially driven by climate change, but we're also going to have to adapt through the lens of climate change. So let's drive down, like, again, more detail on where these nutrients are coming from. So early on in our lake's history, when the river caught on fire in Cleveland, a lot of the nutrients were coming from wastewater treatment plants, or WWTPs. But because of the Clean Water Act that was arguably spurred by the burning of the Cuyahoga River, since the mid-70s, we've seen a 75% reduction in the phosphorus coming out of wastewater treatment plants. So if we go to the edge of every river, and this is specifically for the Maumee, if we go to the edge of the Maumee, only 9% of the phosphorus is coming from the wastewater treatment plants upstream in the Maumee River. Okay. It's not saying that we shouldn't be working to address this nutrient source, right? Reduce it from 9% to basically in half. We're looking for a 40% reduction, but it is telling you that the driver for these blooms is not wastewater treatment plants. It's a contributor, but it's not driving the blooms. CSOs is something that gets brought up with me all the time, is that these combined sewer overflows. So CSO is combined sewer overflow. You in the Cleveland area know about that because you're building $3 billion worth of pipes underneath the city to address these CSOs. But I'm happy to report that as of 2021, 40 of the 62 CSOs have long-term control plans in place. I will tell you, though, even if these weren't addressed, these 62 CSOs, in the Maumee, under 1 year that I have data for, these CSOs only attributed about 1% of the phosphorus leaving the landscape. Now, again, it's not saying that we shouldn't address CSOs. It's not saying we shouldn't go in and reroute these and treat that water rather than discharging to the lake, but they are clearly not driving the issue. I did put another point in here because I don't know how many of you may be familiar through the news that the city of Maumee was recently identified as a city that was violating its point source permits. So each community that has CSOs has an allowable amount of discharge that they're able to do. Well, we found out that the city of Maumee, although permitted to, I think it was 20 million gallons per year, in some years they were discharging upwards of 100 million gallons per year and not reporting that to the EPA. But we did some research on that just to see, with these violations, permitted to do 200 million or 20 million gallons, we're actually releasing 120 million gallons. How much phosphorus would that increase in the lake? And the data shows us, again, it's less than 1%. So clearly we need to clean up these CSOs from a pathogens and a virus and a beach closure perspective, but CSOs are not driving the harmful algal bloom in the western basin of Lake Erie. Septic systems, we now know from our data from US EPA, Ohio EPA, and the Department of Health that these septic systems across the state and in the Maumee watershed are not working always 100% efficiently. And so we found these septic systems, and we're estimating that about 4% of the phosphorus at the end of the Maumee River is coming from failing septic systems. Thankfully, the state is working hard to reduce these. The governor's H2 Ohio initiative is helping clean up or repair some of these septic systems or home sewage treatment systems, but they've also put in place a lot of low and no interest loans to help homeowners rectify those septic systems. A lot of folks early on in this history of HABs, again in the early 2000s, was pointing to lawn fertilizers. We've been working with Scott's Miracle-Gro for quite some time now, but we've seen that since 2013, Scott's Miracle-Gro has pulled phosphorus from basically all of their fertilizer products. So if you go into Ace or Home Depot or Menards or Lowe or your mom and pop, nursery center, if you grab a bag of fertilizer off the shelf, unless it's a starter fertilizer for new seed, all of them will be phosphorus free, because Scott's has done the work and their partners to identify that the vast majority of lawns in Ohio, and I would argue the Great Lakes region, have enough phosphorus to grow a normal lawn. So these blooms are not being driven by current day or home application of Scott's Miracle-Gro or any kind of fertilizer. And the last one I always mention in these talks is that we got to think about what we call internal loading. So is it the nutrients that have been running off the Lake Erie watershed for years and years and years that has finally reached the saturation point in the lake? Is it nutrients already at the bottom of the lake that get brought into the water column to feed these blooms? Well, we've sent out a team in 2014, a very, very intensive year, multiple experiments, and they went out and measured how much phosphorus from the bottom of the lake gets recirculated into the surface to drive these blooms. Because we took multiple methodological approaches, we didn't have a solid answer, but we could show you that about 3 to 7% of the phosphorus that we attribute to growing blooms actually comes from the lake itself. Now, this is a Lake Erie fact. I put verses here because it reminds me some systems in the Great Lakes region will have algal blooms, and those are driven by internal phosphorus. It's not the case for Lake Erie, but some rivers could do that, or lakes could do that. So if you do the math and you add up 9% and 1% and 4% and so on, basically we know that ag activities, not malicious, but ag activities, depending on the year, are somewhere between 65 and 85% of the phosphorus entering our system. Okay. So what I can tell you is that now that we've done research to identify ag is a vast majority of these inputs, again, not often through malicious input, we need to start giving solutions to our producers, to our agricultural community, so that we can reduce those nutrient inputs into the system. And so what I want to say is, or what I want to highlight on this slide, are a lot of those solutions that we've communicated to the farming community. I've titled the slide, before I give you any information here, is "We are directionally correct." This is my opportunity to, as a scientist, communicate my craft to you on this call today. And what I mean by that is that if you find any scientist and they tell you that they proved something, you have my permission to grab their ear and yank it really, really hard. There is no absolute proof in science. There is formulation of research questions, the design of experiments, analysis of data, and the drawing of conclusions. But as scientists, we know that there are a lot of variables in the natural world. And until we test this rigorously, there will be no absolute proof. So with that said, I do not want to get into a place where people that don't understand the craft of science and our inability or our responsibility to say that we don't prove anything as scientists, is that we need to make sure we're not stopping progress for perfect. Okay. So what I'm going to put here is I'm going to put recommendations coming from research on what we should be doing on the landscape. But the people that deploy these practices need to recognize, as we do more research, we might tweak some of these recommendations and we might modify some of them. Because again, absolute proof in the science world is not possible. So let's talk about some of these recommendations right now based on a large amount of data. First one is, thankfully in Ohio, we passed what we call Senate Bill 150. So this happened in, I think, 2015, maybe 2016. We basically passed the 4R nutrient program. And what this means is if you're in the Maumee River Basin and you apply fertilizer on greater than 50 acres of land, you need to take this program. And what it does is teach you how to figure out how to do the right fertilizer source. When is the right time to apply fertilizer? What is the right rate or amount to apply that fertilizer? And even the right place. And what I mean by this is underneath the surface of the soil. We need to put it underground rather than lay it on the surface, because when that nutrient sits on the surface and you get a rain event, it easily or more easily washes off into the system. Okay. The other great thing that we're directionally correct on is Senate Bill 1, which actually was also passed in 2015, basically said you are not allowed to apply on frozen ground. Okay, so we don't want application of fertilizer on frozen ground, both fertilizer, commercial fertilizer, and manure, because what happens if you put it on frozen ground, come spring, you're going to get thaw, and that thaw is going to drive those nutrients that you put on frozen ground into the system. Also in Senate Bill 1 is where it's illegal, again, in the Maumee River Basin to apply fertilizer when the rain is forecasted or on saturated, so soggy soils. I'm going to pause here because these all make a lot of sense from a science lens, right? We know that if you're going to put it on the surface, right, rather than subsurface placement, when it rains, it's going to carry it off. The problem that is if you tell a farmer to do that, that means they now have to inject or band that fertilizer. Unfortunately, the toolbar that they have to put behind their tractor to inject or band is about $250,000. And unfortunately, the tractor they have on their field probably isn't powerful enough to pull those banding or ejecting toolbars. So it's easy for the academics to say we need to put it in subsurface placement, but getting the behavior to change within the agricultural community isn't easy because there's a cost associated. Same thing with the right time. I always say farmers have this window to be on their fields to prep them for growing season. But if you're going to say you can't apply it on frozen ground, that window just did this. And if you're going to say to the farmer you can't apply on rainy ground or soggy ground, that window just did this. So the science makes sense, but the constraints and the stress, I would argue, that we put on our producers is pretty intense and pretty heavy. And so I just want to say that these are great practices, but again, we got to be able to mix the physical science research we do with the social science behavior work that we do. We got to eliminate broadcast applications. So that comes back again to this right placement. What we've done a great job of doing through our time as producers is we found out that a lot of our sediment was being lost from our fields because of our heavy plowing, what was called more moldboard plowing and turning over the soil. So we did a lot of research that says you can still grow a crop with conservation tillage or no tillage. And so we really got the agricultural community to buy in, not this heavy tillage. So the problem is if they're not tilling, they're basically applying that fertilizer right on the surface and not tilling it to incorporate it. So our efforts to stop erosion through conservation tillage has actually focused all the nutrient placement on the surface and not tilling it underground. And so we need to eliminate that broadcast application and do what we call, again, banding or injecting. The next thing, and it comes back to this one right here, right rate or right amount, we need to be soil tested. So farmers now have the capability to go out to their field and test the soil and find out how much phosphorus or nitrogen is already there. And we also know what the agronomic needs are. It's what's called the tri-state fertilizer recommendation. So what we're telling farmers is that even though you think you need that fertilizer and it's a little security blanket to ensure, robust crop growth, we've been able to tell them that if you apply over X amount, it's not going to increase your growth at all. You're actually wasting or spending money on a nutrient that you don't need and will not be capitalizing. The last one is I just want to refer to again, because of climate change, we have a need for water management. Okay, these increased bloom events are happening because we're seeing more nutrients entering the system, and the driver or the mechanism for that, the way we're taking the nutrients from the field and moving into the lake, is because of water movement. So we've got to find ways to disconnect hydrologic pathways. So maybe instead of using drain tiles, we can run that water through wetlands or things called blind inlets. Okay, we do know that a good portion of the phosphorus leaving the field is going through those tiles, the tile drains that we put under our agricultural fields back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s to drain those swamps to grow crops. So we can be using things like cover crops that hold water, or drainage water control structures, or drainage water recycling. So we've been giving a lot of tools to the producers. The problem is most of these things, cover crops, drainage water control structures, drainage water recycling, is not cheap to do. And so the problem is, again, the science backs up water management, but being able to get into the minds and the behaviors of our farmers is what's become a challenge. Not impossible, but a challenge. So let me show you where we've been and where we're going. Crazy slide, I'll walk you through it so we're all on the same place. But basically we're looking at basic Maumee River at Waterville. So it's the last site we measure phosphorus. And this is from March to July. Okay, so what you're seeing, time on the bottom axis and concentration of what's called particulate phosphorus. Particulate phosphorus is when we run the water through a filter paper, it's the amount of phosphorus trapped in this green dot that I'm showing you on this slide. What you can see is every year is represented by a dot in orange, and the solid black line is the running average, the 5-year running average. Okay, so each point on this line is taking the 5 previous years in front of it. This flat line right here at 0.23 milligrams per liter is the target we need to get to see blooms disappear. What you'll see is, thank goodness, we've seen a drop since the early or late 70s, early 80s, but then it seems to have leveled off in the 2000s. There is some variability, as I told you existed before on that heat map, but unfortunately, we're not driving this level down to the target. So this is total particulate phosphorus. It's the stuff trapped on that filter. Well, when you run a water sample through a filter, we also looked at the dissolved phosphorus. Same time frame. This time, instead of particulate phosphorus, it's dissolved. So the clear water, kind of like dissolving sugar in coffee or sugar in water. You don't see it, but it's there. What you'll see is it was high in the late 70s, early 80s. It dropped down primarily because of cleaning up all those wastewater treatment plants, right? Because of the Clean Water Act. Unfortunately, it has risen again. And it has, as you can see, kind of stabilized since the early 2000s. It is variable from year to year, but if you look at the five-year running average, we are not seeing any progress to getting this down to its target line. Okay, so what I can tell you from my work and the work of others that we are funding through NOAA and through Ohio State, to get to a 40% reduction, and that is our target goal. We think if we reduce current day phosphorus by 40%, this bloom will go away. My argument for you today is that we can get there by 3 routes, 3 buckets, I call them. The first one is by following the 4R stewardship, right? So what is your annual relationship with nutrients? Right rate, right time, right place, put it underground, don't put it before rain, don't put it on during the winter. If we can get 85 to 90% of farmers doing that, it gets us a long way to that 40% reduction. The second thing I list is what's called legacy phosphorus. This references the nutrients already in the ground. So it's not the relationship farmers have in a fall before planting or the spring before planting. This is the stuff that was applied 4, 5, 6 decades ago. Sadly, 4, 5, or 6 decades ago, we thought phosphorus stayed put. So when farmers had robust and good years, we encouraged them to put more phosphorus out there than their crops needed because we wanted them to be treating it like a savings account so that they could use that phosphorus later. And so unfortunately, this, along with some concentrated animal feeding operations, have created some what we call hotspots that have old phosphorus. It's not stuff we're using today, but it's old phosphorus. And I'm going to spend a lot of our talk on the next couple slides diving into this. And the last one, as I've mentioned a couple times, is water management. We need to think about how we adapt to the increased number of rain events and the size of those rain events in our watershed. I'm going to ask this question of myself already because usually I get it towards the end of the talk, but is the Lake Erie fix quick? Can we solve this problem in Lake Erie, specifically the Western Basin? As a typical scientist, I'm going to say yes and no. Yes, because we've seen years where 40% less phosphorus came into the lake and the bloom went away. The problem is those years where that happened was because it was a drought year and there was no water moving the nutrients from the field into the lake. So we didn't actually fix the problem by a change in behavior. It's just Mother Nature didn't move that nutrient. It's good news though, because if we hit that 40% mark, the problem goes away literally overnight. The answer of no is because I see a long, costly and difficult road to get those nutrients down by 40% without relying on a drought, with us doing all the things we need to do in the landscape to slow it down. So let's talk about this legacy P a little bit. And I apologize, here's another graph for you, but I'll walk you through it. So what we've learned is this is discharge. This is all Maumee River, folks. So this is in cubic kilometers is on the x-axis. So how much water is going by Waterville in a given year. And this is the amount of phosphorus that's available. This is a great graph. I love this because what it shows you, each black dot represents a year from 2000 to 2018. And what you can see is if you had to draw a line, so if I asked my kids to draw one single line that best represented all those dots, it would be this line right here. That's an awesome predictive relationship. What it tells you is I could go and say, hey, we had 4 cubic kilometers of water this year. I slide up till I hit this line, and then I slide to the left, and I could give you a good darn guess of how many nutrients would come down in that year. So there's an amazing relationship with the amount of water coming down the Maumee and how much phosphorus leaves. So in 2019, we knew how much rain came down. It was really right around this 5 cubic kilometers. So we would have expected 2019 to be right there. Sadly, when we measured 2019, we found out it was actually here. And I would argue of all these data points, that's the one, minus this year right here, that was a furthest break from this trend line. Technically, the loads were 24% lower than we would have predicted based on this relationship, okay? The relationship between the amount of discharge and the amount of phosphorus available. So why the heck did this happen? Well, let me tell you, 2018, the fall of 18, when farmers would be out in the field, and the spring of 19 were so wet, that farmers could not get in the field in 2019 or 2018 of fall or the spring of 2019. We know this because 41% of lands in the Maumee Basin went unplanted in 2019. In a typical year, only 5% don't get planted. So 2019 didn't have a lot of crops out there. Additionally, only roughly half of commercial fertilizers were sold in 2019. Farmers were not going out there and buying fertilizer because they couldn't get it on the ground. Only 15% of manure were applied from March to May in 2019. So basically what I'm trying to show you here, folks, is that 2019 forced us to follow the 4 R's. That one bucket I mentioned, 4 R's. Everybody, current relationship with phosphorus needs to change if everybody, right here, 41% didn't plant, 50% didn't put fertilizers on, not many put manure on. So basically we followed the 4 R's. And that's why that dot dropped down. Why didn't it drop all the way down? 40% is because of legacy phosphorus. 2019 gave us the first opportunity to say how much of that phosphorus leaving the landscape is associated with the first bucket, the 4R nutrient certification, a farmer's relationship on an annual year with nutrients, versus the third bucket, which was legacy, or second bucket, which was legacy P. So here's the problem. Here's why legacy matters. The phosphorus transported to Lake Erie, we now know, is a combination of both legacy and contemporary or current phosphorus use. The other problem is this legacy P is a chronic source. So even if we stop, like 2019 forced our farmers to do, even if we stopped current day application of our nutrients, you're going to have this loss, sadly, for decades and decades. The other thing is untreated legacy. So if we don't start doing practices on the landscape to trap this old phosphorus, it will mask all the amazing things that our producers and our state agencies are doing to slow the loss of nutrients from ag. So unfortunately, but it's good to know this information, phosphorus management will vary depending on where the source is. Is it coming from legacy phosphorus? Is it coming from contemporary phosphorus? Or is it coming from a combination of both? Let me switch gears just a little bit. We'll come back to some of this again, but I definitely want to say after the Toledo water crisis in 2014, our state leadership, specifically the Ohio Department of Higher Education, moved $2 million annually to fund research to address harmful algal blooms. We're calling it the Harmful Algal Bloom Research Initiative, or the HAB Research Initiative. And so thankfully that those funds came to Sea Grant, came to our shop in coordination with the University of Toledo. So I work with the University of Toledo on a regular basis. And basically, we've been running a $2 million a year grant program to give the state agencies and the producers and suburban residents information on how to address HABs in their backyard. So since 2015, we're talking, $12 million-ish. We're talking about probably 70 or 80 projects. And these have been focused in these, 3 areas. This research has to provide guidance on how to produce safe drinking water, because not only are we trying to stop these blooms, but when they produce toxins, we've got to get it out of the drinking water so we don't have another Toledo. So a lot of the projects went there. It's filled a gap on when we do get exposed to these toxins, what is the real impact? We knew it's a liver toxin, but now we're knowing more about how it affects the kidneys, affects people with irritable bowel disease, it affects people with pre-existing liver conditions. And so now we know much more about the health impacts. We now know how these blooms behave. So we know the genes that they have, that they need to have to produce the toxins. We know when they produce toxins and when they don't. We know which nutrients drive toxin production. So we're learning about the organism's behavior. And the last thing, we've learned a lot about addressing nutrient runoff. So we're starting to learn more and more and more every year about what we can do, what levers we can pull to slow down the nutrient loss from the landscape. The great thing about this is every time I get this slug of money each year in the biennial governor's budget, I contact the agencies you see here, the Ohio Lake Erie Commission, DNR, EPA, Health and Ag, and I go directly to the directors and their lead scientists and say, all right, what kind of research questions do you have this year? What kind of projects are we funding? I will share this PowerPoint with your group here, but I want to move through this quickly. But basically, every year we get different priorities from our state agencies. I will tell you that the Department of Ag is really looking at manure management, subsurface placement questions, like how can we get this cost benefit for farmers so that they start subsurface placement, even though there's a cost, we got to show them the benefit. We need them to start learning how to adapt to climate change. So we're funding research projects on that. As far as the DNR, I should go back to that one. The DNR is really looking at wetlands. So how can we use wetlands as a tool in the toolbox to slow nutrient runoff from the system? Lake Erie Commission is looking at some modeling stuff, and Health and EPA are really looking at protecting source water and how to treat toxins that are already in the water. So let's run through some of these. This is, again, the governor's H2 Ohio project. So this is basically somewhere between like 130 and 170 million every year that's going to H2 Ohio. This is what Ag is doing with that. So they are funding soil testing, so farmers can apply to get money from the state to do soil testing. They can do variable rate fertilizer application. They can do subsurface application, so they can get money to buy the toolbars to do subsurface, not only commercial fertilizer, but also manure incorporation. They can get money for crop rotations, and they can get money for cover crops. We're starting just this year to fund drainage water management. So how do we control the water moving the fields? So we're working on this now. I'm worried about how that water being stuck in the fields might impact the soil health, but there's some good work going on here now. We are not funding two-stage ditches or buffer strips yet, but these are on the radar. And then wetlands is the work being done by ODNR. And so I just want to show that ODNR is spent a lot of money. I think there's the most recent number I saw is like almost 90 wetlands are being constructed across the state of Ohio, most of them up on Lake Erie or in the Maumee River watershed to basically trap and filter these nutrients. Actually, I've been asked to pull together a team of scientists from Kent and Akron and Wright State and Toledo and Bowling Green and OSU to build a wetland monitoring program. So not only is DNR building them, but our team has been charged with basically going out there and assessing how well they're working. So as they build new wetlands, we can say, build it like that one, try not to build it like that one. And so we're trying to point them to the best functioning wetlands. I want to talk about this. This is what's called the tri-state fertilizer recommendation. So as I told you, we know from our science how much phosphorus you need to have in your field to grow X, Y, and Z crop. It's different for corn than it is for wheat, than it is for soybeans, than it is for specialty crops. What I wanted to show you here is this issue with legacy phosphorus a little bit again. So what you're seeing is this is soil test phosphorus here on the vertical, and year is on the horizontal. These are different counties. We don't want to point out the specific farmer, but this is a farm in Clark County versus Wayne versus Wood. And these dotted lines set up that fertilizer range. So you want to be inside this band. You don't need to be above it because it's a waste. And if you don't want to be below it, because you could actually impact yield, the amount of crops you grow. What I want to show you here is the red circles mean what would happen in Clark County if I stopped applying fertilizer, so 0. And what it shows you is that nutrients in the soil drops down fairly quickly. After 4-ish years, they're in trouble. They got to add fertilizer or their crops are going to be impacted. But look at Wayne County. They stopped fertilizing here in 06 and it took 8 years before it hit that bottom range. And within Wood County, it was weird. It fluctuated and bounced up and down. If you're applying at the fertilizer recommendation at one time or the recommendation, you'll see that it drops less quickly. And then if you double that amount, which we're never encouraging for our farmers, you will see that those numbers in yellow are too elevated. The reason why I put this slide here is because my recommendation is that this range from the top of where you don't need to over apply and the bottom where you need to start thinking about applying because you're going to lose productivity. I think we shouldn't be aiming to be at the top of this thing. We should probably be aiming as a farmer for the middle of this range, because in none of these scenarios does it go from middle to outside within 1 year. And so what I think we could be doing is, even though we have this tri-state information in hand, we might want to consider shrinking those bands a little bit, because the loss across our fields isn't as rapid as we think it should be. And the last one I want to spend time with you on is manure, because this is the question I would argue we're getting the most right now in the Western Basin of Lake Erie. So I want to just level set on what we know and perhaps dispel some of the rumors that are floating around. Busy chart. I'll walk you through it again, though. So basically, year is in the first column.
We lost the sound.
Oh, what's that?
Oh, that's okay now.
Okay, sorry. So I'll walk you through this. Here's year, and the very bottom is the average. So we'll draw our attention to the average here at the bottom. So I want to describe the columns for you. Point sources, that's what I told you about earlier, EPA. These are all the pipes in the Western Basin of Maumee, and the EPA has these data. So the first number is total phosphorus, and the second number is that dissolved phosphorus. Okay, so total phosphorus and just the dissolved component. Inorganic fertilizer is that stuff that we buy from, that farmers buy from stores. So the commercial fertilizer they buy and have applied to their fields. Manure is the amount of manure applied for fields as that nutrient. And if you add these together, that's what we call the land applied. So this is both commercially bought fertilizer and manure combined. And then soil sources is our legacy. Okay, so this is a publication, came out in 2021. And so basically we have point sources, we have inorganic, so commercially bought, we have manure, and then we have legacy fields. So let me summarize it by looking at the averages. For dissolved reactive phosphorus, okay, the part that's dissolved, the first part, the most, comes from inorganic. 45% of the phosphorus is coming from the commercial stuff we buy. So we got to get those farmers to not buy fertilizer and put it on if they don't need it. The second one is legacy. 30% of the dissolved phosphorus entering the river every year, on average, is coming from that old stuff. Point source is third. So these are the wastewater treatment plants and things like that. And manure is fourth. I'm not saying that we ignore the number of animals in the Western Basin of Lake Erie, but they're not to blame for the entire problem. If we look at it not from a dissolved reactive phosphorus, but from a total phosphorus, legacy is actually number one, 50% of the phosphorus. Inorganic, meaning store-bought fertilizer, is 36%. Point source comes in at third, and manure again at fourth. So I am not saying to you today that managing our cows and managing our manure and our pigs is not important. But we don't want to blame the entire issue of the Western Basin harmful algal blooms just on animal operations. They're a part of the problem and can be a part of the solution, but most of it is either inorganic fertilizer or legacy contributions. I'm happy to stop there. I can leave my screen sharing, and if people, I see there's a chat here real quick, so let me see if I can go to that one. Small urban watersheds, yeah. So the question is it worth trying to reduce PNN in small urban watersheds, typically of the Central Basin South Shore? If yes, is HUI a source of funding for? So I would argue you've got better idea of that solution to pollution is dilution in the Central Basin, because that's a deeper part of Lake Erie. It's not very shallow. It's actually pretty deep. And I would argue that the blooms we typically see in the Central Basin of these harmful algal type are either coming from a CSO discharge, and they're very temporary, there and gone, or it's a bloom that started in the Western Basin and is just blown east. Now, I do think, nutrients are important to keep on the landscape. We don't need to get them into the lake. But right now, I would say your solutions in Cleveland and the surrounding areas are not going to fix the problems west of us. And I'll see if Roy has any follow-up to that, but I'm also happy to take other questions.
All right, well, if Roy doesn't have any follow-up to that, and Roy, just hop in if you do. Another question from Bill, a question for after he is done. What is the percentage of remaining wetlands in the other Great Lakes watersheds? You mentioned Erie only has 10%.
That's a great question. I can, let me look into that. I only know it for Erie. It is definitely nowhere near what it is in Erie. So 90% loss is the other Great Lakes pale in comparison to it. We also have a lot of, we have the most amount of people. And so that's why we lost a lot of our wetlands, because we came in and drained a lot of those to put people in ag in place. We also have in the other Great Lakes, we have a lot of First Nation and indigenous groups around there. And so they've retained a lot of the wild rice and a lot of that kind of relationship with the land. So whoever asked that question, I'd be happy to send the answer that I can find. I'll send it to Steve, and Steve, if you want to distribute this PowerPoint and the answer to that question, I'll take care of that.
Absolutely, and I'll also include your email. That was Bill Hughes that asked
Bill,
that question.
Great, and I see the question coming from Ramona. Heck yeah, I'd love to give you the PowerPoint. These are easy for me to do, these talks. If you want to have a guest speaker in your classroom, let me know. Either me or one of the staff members can try and flex our schedules around and come see you, or if you can save money and do a field trip, we'd love to have you out to Stone Laboratory. Yep, great, Ramona. My email address, I'll type it on the screen here in a sec, or I'll put it in the chat. Just send me an email and I'll work with you to potentially find a date either for me or somebody on my staff. So that's it, Winslow.33. So I'm the 33rd Winslow to matriculate at OSU, and it's osu.edu. Please, any one of you, feel free to send me an email and I can help you out in any way possible.
Excellent. There was one above Ramona from Clark Button. Is Wayne County different because of increased manure compared to other counties?
That'll have a little bit of a role. The problem is what we found is that no farm is like another farm. So there's just a history of use in those regions. But I would also argue soil type, slope, past cropping history, presence and absence of animals. So all of those counties, you could be in one field and drive 20 miles west, and the conditions on that field are going to be, substantially different. And so the problem we're facing is that I think the general public says, well, once we find that this is causing runoff, we'll just deploy it across the entire state or the entire Maumee River watershed, and the problem goes away. I wish it was that simple, but no. So I would argue Wayne has probably got an animal contribution. I bet you Wayne County has a difference in soil type and slope and moisture concentration. I'm seeing how much of Ohio ag is factory farming. That is a huge operation that we could, yep. So the rough estimation is that about 20% of the nutrients applied in any given year are from animal operations. And then, yeah, so it is a small component of fertilizer application. I would say that many of those farms are actually permitted. If they have over a certain number of animals, they're called CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations. If they're a CAFOs, they are actually permitted and regularly monitored by Ohio Department of Ag. The issue we get into is the manure produced out of what we call medium facilities. So they didn't hit that large threshold. Those are the ones where we don't know how those farmers are engaging or what relationship they have with their manure because they're not permitted. So we need to do a little bit more research, and Ag is doing a little bit more research on, do we need to lower that threshold of what makes a large operation, or do we add a separate set of regulations or maintenance or monitoring associated with the class that are called medium operations? Yeah, and you're right. Usually when we ask for these things to buy new toolbars and to do subsurface placement, it's not the large farms that have a problem. Their profit margins are such that they typically can afford those large pieces of equipment. The issue we have is the small and medium operations typically don't. For sure, the small operations, most of those folks that are only farming, 50 to 300 acres, they have other jobs. And so this farming is kind of a side job for them. And so they really don't have the cost structure, the revenue versus expenses to do that. So typically the larger farms are good actors because they're able to follow these 4R recommendations a little bit easier and quicker than the medium and small farms. So why is legacy P in the soil not available? It is, but again, a plant only needs a certain amount of nutrients. And so it's only going to draw from the soil what it needs to grow. So if the fields have 10, 15 times more phosphorus than the plant needs, they don't touch it. It just sits there. And that's why if it's sitting there because it's not taken up in the plant material, it's just sitting there to be washed away by future rain events. I'm seeing the effect of Canada. I love the fact that we have such friendly neighbors to the north. They're great. I mean, all the research projects that I fund usually have a Canadian counterpart on it. The monitoring we do in the lake is jointly between Environment and Climate Change Canada and US EPA and state EPA. I'm happy to report that their version of NSF, so in the United States, NSF is a large funding agency. Their version is called NSERC. NSERC has invested a lot more money in the Great Lakes than they have historically, and they've built a new relationship with NSF so that we can be co-funding Canadian and US people on the same projects. So our Canadian counterparts are great. They do have an issue in what's called the Thames River. So the Thames River has a lot of agriculture in Ontario. The Thames River does not dump directly into Lake Erie. It actually dumps into Lake St. Clair. And then we get the nutrients coming from Lake St. Clair down through the Detroit River. Now they're lucky. I don't know if that's the right choice of words, but almost 90% of the water coming into Lake Erie comes from the Detroit River. Most people think that all these rivers, the Grand and the Conneaut and the Rocky and the Black, produce all this river to fill up Lake Erie. They are trickles relative to what's coming down the Detroit River. So all those nutrients coming down the Thames, they get the benefit of being diluted by the Detroit River before it dumps into Lake Erie to cause blooms. We don't have anything that's diluting the Maumee or the Sandusky rivers. Laura, thanks for the kind comment about Stone Lab. I will pass that on to the staff. That's awesome to see.
I have a question for you.
Please.
In 2019, I participated in Decision Makers Day at the Stone Lab. It was like August 23rd. And it was a bunch of elected officials that were invited to participate so they could learn about this. That was obviously pre-COVID, so I'm sure the program stopped, but are there any plans for that to return, and what other engagement with policymakers does your organization do? Love it.
So two major ones for the state and federal folks. So the Decision Makers Day is back. We offer it twice a year. So it's usually in August and September. Any opportunity they get to get out of the office and hang out on an island, they jump at it. And it's an opportunity to have a captive audience. So that is actually on the books. Only one version this year. We're kind of slowly ramping up post-COVID. So one Decision Makers Day. Every September, and I can get you I'll put the web link in here in the chat before we go. We offer the State of the Lake meeting. It's in September. It's always at the Stranahan in Toledo. And it is a one-day meeting where we just put a bunch of researchers out there for folks to hear the newest updates relative to HABs and nutrients. And we typically get 4 or 5 elected officials at that event. So those are the two major ones. I do get the pleasure of spending time in DC at the federal side. So I go up because I am NOAA funded. So I get to lobby basically to continue supporting Sea Grant and NOAA. So I'm always talking about the work that's going on here. They ask me for my recommendations. I try and tell them I'm a researcher and not a policy writer, but I will tell them the science. The other one I wanted to let you know, and it's not necessarily for elected officials, but indirectly it is, we host a 2-day science writers event. So we send out emails to a bunch of science writers. We have money from the Joyce Foundation to host a 2-day workshop. And we invite, it's about 20 to 30 science writers, and they come up and spend 2 days with us, spend overnight. And we do the same thing. We run researchers in front of them. And the beauty of that is that we see a pulse of a bunch of news reports or articles in newspaper that, of course, I imagine our elected officials are picking up. So I would say those are our 3 biggest: the decision makers annually, State of the Lake meeting in Toledo, the science writers is an indirect contact, and then I'm that annoying guy up at DC asking for more money to help Lake Erie out.
What is the feedback that you get from producers when you talk about all this? Like how do you meet them where they are? And yeah, are they?
Yeah, so I probably give non-COVID, I probably give somewhere between 40 and 60 talks to just basically an ag producer audience. a lot of soil and water conservation meetings, a lot of monthly, corn district meetings, those sorts of things. I would say 90% of the audience is sitting there nodding their heads when they hear the talk that I just gave you. The talk I just gave you is identical. I don't care whether I'm speaking to your group, Friends of Euclid Creek, legislators, media, or farmers. It is exactly the same thing. I am not sugarcoating anything. I tell them they're 65 to 85% of the phosphorus. I also say, I know it's hard for you to buy a toolbar, and I know it's hard for you not to be out there in winter. And when I'm saying those things, they're nodding their heads. When I tell them, guys and gals, manure is a problem. It is not as bad as they're painting it in the media, but it is a problem and you need to fix it. Occasionally I'll get somebody that comes up at the end of the talk and says, I don't agree with what you said. This is wrong. But they're getting it. And really, I think they appreciate it because I try and do it in a here's what you need to be doing. We understand why you can't. Here's some solutions to help you get to the saying I can't anymore. And I think they appreciate it. Honestly, right now, I think they're just stressed because they're dealing with climate change in wet fields. They're stressed because they think regulations are going to come down because of HABs. And they're stressed because COVID's just been a total pain in the hiney for everybody. But for the most part, they're receptive. And I haven't had any nasty altercations or anything like that. So I think it's been pretty good.
All right, I think we have one more.
Oh, yeah.
RL.
Increase wetland area effectiveness in the Western Basin. So Roy, the problem here is finding land that is either state owned or privately owned that's willing to be converted back into wetlands is tough. The other thing is not all soil types are the same. We know that some soil types, and they're called xeric, they bind nutrients better than others. So you have to have a soil chemistry that's ideal for holding those nutrients. So the best way is to really tell people by doing this, you're saving nutrient runoff into the lake. You're creating habitat for fishes, for macroinvertebrates, for birds. So we just got to really talk about the benefits of wetlands and just find a willing person to turn over that land for that purpose. Is the cost barrier to agricultural equipment, you mentioned, the largest barrier to implementation? If there could be fun, yes. So I wouldn't say it's the largest, but it is a barrier. Here's the problem. Remember, you can't be out there on frozen ground, can't be out there when it's raining, can't be out there when it's soggy. The window for farmers to be out there, we thought we could buy equipment in a township or a county or in a city and let people just use it. They all want it on the same darn day, right? So the problem isn't the fact that we just buy it for it and then they share it. The window is tight to be out there, and so the use and the request for that is tough. But we are subsidizing some of that. I know a colleague of mine wrote a grant. Laura Johnson at Heidelberg University bought a grant to purchase that piece of equipment for her community. So it happens, but it's got to be more ways to get it to a specific farmer rather than a community used piece of equipment. Any testing done in Arcola Creek watershed? Not to my knowledge. Again, I'm sadly, once I put on the director hat, I do a lot of report writing and email sending and not as much field work. So I don't know what effort's been done in that specific creek, but I will copy the chat function here and I will get that information out to you folks. Let me see if I can stop sharing because I want to go to our website and find some of these dates that I promised you. So said I would get you state of the science. So let me look at that quick, and I can multitask. So if you got another question for me, bring it on.
All right, yeah, there is. How often throughout a crop season does soil testing need to be done in order for it to be effective?
That's a great question. So actually, we're actually recommending only once every 3 years. So usually, as you saw, remember that graph that showed Clark, Wayne, and the other county, those values don't drop from year to year, ever, even on ones where you don't apply. And so if they were basically testing every 2 or 3 years, that should be enough. That didn't work. That should be enough for us to be able to track trends through time. Okay, so if you go to that web link, it'll bring you to a web page, and at the bottom of that web page, it's not active yet. It says registration coming in June. So just go to that website in June and you can sign up for our State of the Science meeting. We'd love to have you there. I don't think it costs anything. It might, if it does, it's like $5 or $7. I can't remember now.
All right. Well, geez, Dr. Chris Winslow, holy cow, that was an awesome presentation. Thank you
Good.
so much for taking the time to chat with our group. Be sure to click all those links in the chat and have them in your browser ready to go. I'm seeing some hand clapping, so I think you did a fantastic job. We will have this posted on the Friends of Euclid Creek website in the next couple days. That's where you can also register for any of our upcoming events, learn about our scholarship program for seniors in high school and any student in college. Those applications are open now as well, and that's friendsofeuclidcreek.com. So Chris, thanks again so much for everything. Thank you to all of you who signed up for this presentation, and I hope everybody has a great rest of their week.
Awesome. Love all the virtual hand claps. Thanks. I've captured the chat. Steven, I got a crazy week. So if you don't see a response from me over the next couple days, just poke me and I'll get you the PowerPoint and I'll try and answer some of those questions.
All right, beautiful. Thank you so much.
Have a good evening.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.